You are a beginner quilter and you've never made a quilt before and you want to get started. What do you need? Well, the honest answer to that is probably not very much. And if you think back 200 or more years, people would have had a minimal amount of equipment. So some fabric, hand sewing needle, some thread and some scissors, and maybe some paper to make some templates, and you would be away, wouldn't you? So if you really want to get cracking and you're very determined, you need a very small amount of equipment. However, quilting has moved on and there is an absolute plethora of equipment available to buy. So what should you get to start with? So whereas scissors used to be the weapon of choice for cutting out your fabric, we have now moved on to rotary cutters, cutting mats and rulers, and they do make the job a lot easier. They make it faster and also more accurate. So the first thing you need to buy is a cutting mat, and there are many types on the market and some are great quality and not so much. So what I would say to you is, if it's pretty cheap, it's probably not going to have a very good surface, might be a bit too slidey, your work's going to slip on it. So, you know, good brands, Olfa, various ones like that, and try to get a cutting mat that's not too small. So, you know, of a kind of medium size is a good starting point. Too small and you'll quickly find that it's smaller than you actually need. So a cutting mat. And then you will need to buy a rotary cutter and maybe a pack of spare blades. Now, again, there are many types on the market, some very simple, some very complex, and they are also available in a range of sizes. But the most common size is the size that you see here, which has a 45mm blade, and that's a really good starting point. And this is a basic Olfa rotary cutter, and it's what I've always used, and I don't see any necessity to spend any more money. Cheap ones, the blade doesn't roll very well and they make cutting not a smooth action. So, you know, you spend a little bit of money on it, but this one is designed to sit in the palm of your hand with your forefinger on the top, and it's an extension of your arm. So it's a really simple one to use. You just open it up to cut. Every time you've made a cut, you're going to close it, and that will protect you and the blade from getting nicked, because if you go over a pin or just nick the blade, every time you want to cut from it, it won't cut through a thread at each rotation, and it's very frustrating. So don't need to get really fancy rotary cutter, just a simple one. You will need specific quilters rulers, and the difference between these and regular rulers is that they are 1/8 of an inch thick, so they're quite thick, and the reason for that is so that the blade has got something to be guided against. Okay, and there again are dozens, I mean literally dozens of different sizes and shapes available, made by many different manufacturers. I like Omnigrid, but it's by all means not the only one. There are lots and lots of different manufacturers. I would say one of your most useful sizes is 6 inches wide by 24 inches long. It's great for cutting bigger pieces, long borders, that kind of thing. So that's quite a good buy. You can go smaller, but you know, that's a good one. I think a small square is very useful. This is actually a 6.5 inch square as opposed to a 6 inch square, and I just find that just is a little bit more useful. If you're making a block, for example, that has a 6 inch finished section in it, you need to add 1/4 inch seam allowance on all sides, which means you're cutting a square at 6.5 inches. So that 6.5 inch ruler is square is really helpful. What I would also say to you is look at rulers that number from a whole inch, and we are in inches for this. So this is 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, and so on, and the extra 1/2 inch is on the end. Some rulers start with 1/2 inch, and they will have 1/2 inch, and then 1, and then 2, and so on, and it just is much easier to measure with rulers that start with a whole inch. So that is a good size for a beginner, but as you move on, you can get larger squares. 9 inches, 12 inches, 15 inches, but start with the 6.5. It's a useful size. And then a ruler I use often for trimming things and checking measurements is a 1x6 inch ruler. It's just a really nice handy little ruler just to measure little bits without having to kind of deal with the great big thing like that. So, and you will build up as you go along, but those are your good starting points in terms of rulers and squares. In terms of scissors, you don't need a big range of scissors and you don't need big scissors because your fabric cutting is going to be done with your rotary cutter and your cutting mat and rulers. So your scissors are more for trimming little bits, snipping little bits, cutting threads. I personally have a big range of scissors, but my go-to ones that I use the most often are these Karen K Buckley scissors. The particular ones that I like are these blue handled ones. They really cut nicely and they're very comfortable with nice big handles that are very soft and squashy. But small scissors, good sharp small scissors, you'll be fine. Don't need big shears. And then in addition to that, you will need some needles and pins and threads and obviously a sewing machine, which is a whole nother talk that you can find elsewhere on our channel. But in terms of sewing machine needles, when you are making a quilt top using relatively fine fabrics, I suggest a size 70 needle. It's a relatively small needle, penetrates those fine layers very nicely. So a size 70 needle. For hand sewing needles, I suggest embroidery needles in size 9 or 10. They have a long, thin eye, so they're easy to thread, but it isn't a fat eye, so they glide through your fabric nicely. And in terms of pins, I do actually think any old pin will not do. And the finer the pin, the better it is because it won't distort the work as you're pinning two plies together. And I personally like pins that are 0.4 of a millimetre in diameter. These particular ones happen to be made by Clover and they have glass heads. That's 0.4 of a millimetre. It is quite important really that you have really good pins and needles. And then you will need some thread. And thread is a whole nother story in itself, but I like to use fine thread for my quilt top making, and I use polyester threads more often than cotton threads because they are lint free and nice and elastic. Now I'm not going to go into detail with this because you can find much more detail in our classes, particularly in our beginner quilter class, which takes you right from the start to the finish of a project. It tells you everything about rotary cutting, choosing fabric, sewing, pressing, all the rest of it. But in the bottom, I use Superior Threads bottom line in the bobbin, and in the top of the sewing machine, I most often these days use 100 weight silk thread. This particular one happens to be Superior Threads Kimono Silk. So if you want to start building up a collection for your quilt making journey, then these are essentials to get you going, and then you will find the world is your oyster and you can spend as much or as little as you like on quilting equipment and fabric.